I am delighted to welcome my guest today, who is Congressman Ken Buck. He is currently serving in his fourth term as a Republican member of Congress representing Colorado's 4th Congressional District. He is, for our purposes, quite importantly, the ranking member of the House Subcommittee on Antitrust, Commercial, and Administrative Law, and he has just been dubbed today by the news site Verge as, quote, the new face of Republican antitrust. Congressman Buck, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Well, thank you, Glenn. It's good to be with you.
You too. So I want to begin with that kind of title that has been bestowed on you, this Republican new face of Republican antitrust. And it's obviously in the context of support you've announced for a bipartisan piece of legislation designed to apply antitrust laws to what is colloquially called big tech. And I want to ask you kind of about your own personal trajectory on this issue, because recently, for the last, say, 3 or 4 decades, antitrust enforcement has been an issue more associated with kind of the liberal side of the political spectrum. Although going back, to the turn of the century, obviously Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican president, was the famous trust buster who kind of pioneered how to apply these laws. What has been your trajectory during your 4 terms of Congress in coming to the conclusion that there was a problem with antitrust and large Silicon Valley companies?
Well, first, Glenn, let me say that if I'm the face of antitrust Republicans are hurting because they can do much better than this face to sort of project a good image. And it is kind of lonely. I'm not sure they should use the word Republicans in the plural. There are times where I look around and there aren't a whole lot of Republicans. I think it's absolutely essential that we take where Donald Trump led us and continue with the Republican Party. And Donald Trump understood the needs of the blue collar worker, the working people in America, and how not only was government suppressing innovation, but also the big corporations, the mega corporations. And so when I got involved in this investigation, there was an 18-month investigation in the last Congress. What I saw was these 4 companies, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, just suppressing their competitors and knocking them out of the market and using their monopoly position to censor conservatives. There's a lot of debate among Republicans about whether we should go after 230 or whether we should go after monopoly laws. In my view, this is really all about monopoly. If we have 5 Googles, we're going to have a lot better chance of getting our voice heard and getting information to conservatives.
So let me kind of attach myself to that part of your answer where you said it seems kind of lonely to be a Republican advocate for a greater antitrust legislation. I find it a little bit confusing, to be perfectly honest, because every time I'm on a conservative television program, every time I see House members on conservative cable outlets or speaking to conservative websites, they're waving the banner of anti-big tech rhetoric. And they're saying big tech is repressing us. They're censoring conservative voices. They become way too centralized. They sound as though they recognize what a menace monopolistic power in the hands of these 4 companies has become. And yet then you look at their actions in the House as lawmakers, as opposed to cable news hosts. And not only don't you see very much action following up on that rhetoric, a lot of times you see the very same people saying those things impeding what would be meaningful solutions. What explains this disparity in your view?
It's a great question. All I know is that these 4 companies spend around $50 million a year in Washington, D.C. to influence public policy. They spend it on the right, they spend it on the left, they spend it with think tanks and other foundations, they spend it on campaigns and various groups, and they have a lot of influence in Washington, D.C. And I think that the idea that we can introduce a partisan bill in Congress when we're in the minority and have it pass is ridiculous. And to think that it will be signed by President Biden is ridiculous. And to not do anything about these monopolies for 3.5 years while President Biden is in office is, in my mind, just incredible and a dereliction of our duty.
One of the principal grievances that a lot of conservatives voice about Facebook, at least in Google, and Amazon is the censorship complaint, that censorship is often used as a weapon to silence conservative voices and to tilt the playing field of our discourse in a way that is more compatible with the ideology of the leaders of these corporations. And one of the things I've tried to do is to explain to the left, which oftentimes is supportive of corporate censorship, that it actually isn't just conservatives who are being targeted with this kind of censorship. There are also lots of anti-establishment left-wing voices. There are Palestinian advocates and journalists who are routinely censored. It's really not exclusive to conservatives, because once you start this censorship power, it tends to expand pretty much to anybody who is in any way a critic of the prevailing ruling class or the ruling ideology. But independent of, and I want to return to the question of censorship, but independent of the censorship question, that they're censoring conservative voices, what are the problems that you see with the concentration of monopolistic power in the hands of these four companies?
So during the Obama administration, President Obama brought a lot of people from Silicon Valley into his administration, and there were 750 high-tech mergers, 750 that went with zero scrutiny by the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. 750. These companies have grown into these mega companies with their finger in just about every pie. And the real problem is that they really suppress innovation. They stop competition. They hurt consumers in the process of what they're doing. I think part of how they hurt consumers is this idea that Amazon can sell one book but not another book. They can shadow ban a book that they disagree with the idea, or that liberals might find controversial. But that's only part of how they hurt consumers. They hurt consumers ultimately with prices and in quality. And you and I both know that as monopolies continue, they get worse and worse until competitors in the marketplace come and knock them out. That could be 30 or 40 years down the road, and we just can't afford that. If we're going to stay ahead of China, and China is another subject I'd love to visit with you about, because I think that's where these companies learn their censorship techniques and other techniques. But if we're going to stay ahead of China in the world marketplace, we've got to do it with our innovation.
So, one of the things that I think is really interesting that a lot of people actually don't know, including a lot of people who pay attention to politics and journalists, is that there was a report in the last term issued by the subcommittee on which you're the ranking member, led by Congressman Cicilline, that in a very comprehensive and detailed way described the reasons that those four companies, Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple, are classic monopolies and need to have legislative or regulatory solutions to rein in their power. And I want to ask you two things about that. One is, I know that there's some dissension, given how it's a 400-page report. Obviously, there's going to be some disagreement about the solutions it proposes. But do you agree with the basic conclusion about these four companies being classic monopolies and the reasons for that? And what about the argument that you'll typically hear when you point that out or make that argument, that people will say, no, look, I mean, what's to stop somebody from creating a new social media platform to compete with Facebook? Or, why do you have Bing or Jeeves or other search engines that can compete with Google? These are not monopolies. Someone can go and create a new Amazon. If you believe that that argument is not persuasive, why isn't it?
So in my view, they are classic monopolies. 94% of desktop searches are performed on Google, and many of the searches performed on Google, you don't even know are being performed on Google. Google has their tentacles in a whole lot of different areas, and through cybersecurity regulations, which they help pass through the federal government, they're acquiring data from all kinds of other search engines and able to use that. So they have a tremendous advantage, as do the other four other three corporations that we've talked about. The way they use this is, in my view, hurts consumers. So let me just give you a quick example. When you search on Google, who owns that data? in my view, you own the data. It should be yours to decide what you want to do with it. But you go in and you sign a 23-page user agreement, and on page 17 or wherever it is, there's a statement in there that Google can sell your data to advertisers, and they make a profit off of that. So the idea that Bing can compete once Google has this monopoly position in the marketplace just isn't right. If you own your data, you can take that. And now just like cell phone companies, you can take your cell phone number and move it to different cell phone companies. And that's one of the bills that we're offering here. You can take your data and you can take it to Bing, and Bing will pay you for that. Or you can take it to DuckDuckGo, and DuckDuckGo will say, no, we won't sell it to advertisers if privacy is your primary issue. So the portability of that data that you should own is essential to competition. And that's what we're trying to do here, is not break up a company, but rather create competition from the ground up.
So let me ask you about that, this idea of competition. Again, I find the politics so interesting in a way, because if you look at the standard kind of conservative right-wing think tanks that have shaped economic and fiscal policy in the right flank of the Republican Party for decades, the American Enterprise Institute, Americans for Tax Reform, the Heritage Foundation, they seem to be very much on the side of big tech. And going back to kind of the era of Reaganomics, where a lot of antitrust enforcement first was kind of gutted based on the kind of conservative view that, no, we believe in laissez-faire economics. The government should stay out of the marketplace and shouldn't be regulating it. And yet, you ran as, just for people who may not know, you're not kind of known as this very sort of moderate Republican. You ran in 2010 for the Senate, more or less affiliated with the Tea Party. You have been an outspoken supporter of President Trump. You are a real deal conservative, and yet have taken up this cause. So what is it, just when we look at this split on the right, and there's a split among Democrats as well, just to be clear, not every Democrat is on board to standing up to big tech either. Plenty of them are in the pocket of Google and Facebook and are protecting them as well. But when we look at the split on the right, is it just the idea that these big tech companies are using their lobbyists and their money to kind of co-opt or, influence members of the right who say that they worry about big tech into not doing anything? Or is there like an ideological split about what the proper role of government is in regulating these industries?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I'm not going to anybody's motive and suggesting they get a $2,000 donation from Google and therefore they're in Google's pocket. I just don't believe that. I do believe that, and I am one of the leaders in Congress, frankly, in the Republican Party, of being afraid of big government. I don't vote for appropriations bills because not only am I concerned about the national debt, but I'm also concerned about the power that the federal government has and how we've lost the sense of federalism and really the scheme that our founders set up in this country. I think that the argument is between, is big government more scary or is big tech more scary? And I think we've got to get big tech under control and then make sure that we use everything we can to assure Americans that the FBI isn't out of control and the IRS isn't out of control, and that we aren't spying on our own citizens. I think all of those tools are available, but right now we have to use what we can to give both tools and resources to the antitrust enforcers to make sure that these companies don't usurp the role of government. Government can't censor speech unless it's in certain categories leads to violence or whatever. Those rules don't apply to a private corporation. And so we have to make sure that these private corporations don't become so powerful that they accomplish that which government can't under our Constitution.
Yeah, let me zero in a little bit on that censorship question, because I think the first time I ever reported on Facebook's brute censorship of political speech, it was, I think, in 2016 or 2017, maybe even earlier, 2015, when I reported on how the Israeli government was submitting various accounts of Palestinian journalists and Palestinian activists, claiming that they were not just advocating for the Palestinian cause, but doing so in such a way as to incite violence. And I think 98% of the cases, Facebook was accepting those requests and was censoring very mainstream Palestinian journalist in the West Bank. And I raised that alarm then as a concern. And obviously, since then, the focus has kind of shifted, at least in the American framework, to conservative voices being censored. For me, the most disturbing example by far was 3 weeks before the election when Twitter and Facebook united to simply ban any discussion of the New York Post reporting on the Hunter Biden laptop. You tried to post the link on Twitter and it was very similar to China. It would just say this link is not permissible. And Facebook kind of algorithmically suppressed it. And then, of course, the removal of President Trump, the destruction of Parler, that was done by Amazon, Apple, and Google using Amazon, and Google and Apple using their monopoly power. What do you think is driving that censorship aimed at conservatives? Is it really the idea that like Mark Zuckerberg and the head of Google, the top level of Google, are just Democrats and liberals and want to help the conservative cause? Or is it that they kind of see the playing field in Washington now dominated by Democrats with control over both houses of Congress and obviously with the executive branch, and know that in order to have their interests served in Washington, they need to aggrandize the dominant party? Like, what do you think is behind these censorship moves?
Yeah, I think it's purely ideological. I don't think it's necessarily a business move at all. I don't even think it's the people at the top of these monopolies. I think the liberals go from top to bottom in these companies. We know that Google changed their algorithm 6 months before the election to disadvantage President Trump and to advantage now President Biden. And they can change the information that Americans see, and they can move millions of votes by doing that. I don't know that they're trying now to help the Democrats because the Democrats are in control. I think they were trying to help the Democrats before the Democrats got in control and help them get into control. I think it's unbelievable the amount of power that a news organization has. And it's why it's so important to make sure we disperse that power among various news organizations. Nobody suggests that cable TV censors people. We know that MSNBC has a bias and Fox News has a bias, but they don't censor people because we have this wide variety of news. The same with newspapers. We have the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. We have the New York Post and the Washington Post. That's not censorship. That's the marketplace of ideas working the way it should. Facebook doesn't work the way it should, and Google doesn't work the way it should. And that's why competition is so important.
So, it's interesting. There is case law going back 30, 40 years on the Supreme Court level that says that if the government sufficiently pressures or coerces private actors to censor in a way that if the private actors did it, they would be perfectly entitled, it can actually start to raise First Amendment concerns. There's a big difference between, say, a bookstore deciding they're going to remove conservative authors from the inventory that they sell versus a zoning board or a city council telling them, if you don't remove conservative authors from your inventory, we're going to start to punish you or withdraw benefits, which happened. And the Supreme Court says it is spilled over into the First Amendment realm. Two questions about that. For me, the biggest, I've watched a lot of these hearings where they summon these CEOs of Twitter, Facebook, Google, and I watch one Democrat after the next essentially demanding, you need to take down what we consider hate speech. You need to take down what we consider disinformation. If you don't, you're going to suffer the consequences. You've promised repeatedly that you will, and we don't think you are. My first question about that is, do you think that it has kind of spilled over into a realm where there's almost like a spillover where this enormous power that these companies have is sort of being co-opted or channeled into Democratic Party officials? And as you said earlier, you don't want the government dictating to the private sector how they can regulate speech, what information or views they have to have on their platform. So what are the solutions to the censorship problem that you as a lawmaker feel comfortable considering?
First of all, I think it's funny. The case law that you're referencing has to do with pornography, and to compare conservative speech to pornography is a is a great comparison, I think. But I don't think that I think the Supreme Court made it clear that government through zoning laws can't change that which is legal otherwise and covered by the free speech. But I do think that what's going on is just a lack of competition. It's a Google. If Google changes its algorithms, it's impacting hundreds of millions of people that are searching for information to make a decision on how they want to vote. And by doing that, they have the power to alter elections. And I think when Democrats are talking to the CEOs of those companies, it's no different than when Republicans are talking to the CEOs of those companies. And we talk about making sure that the leader of Syria doesn't have a Facebook account and is able to spew out anti-Israeli hate, or the leader of Iran. And so I think that those CEOs are in a difficult position there. But if there were 5 Googles and 6 Facebooks, I think we'd have a whole different situation.
So when you talk about censorship and legislative solutions or regulatory solutions, is that your solution? Some people have talked about, for example, a law that would say, we're going to apply First Amendment case law and bind these companies in terms of how they censor to First Amendment case law on the grounds that they're monopolies and we can therefore regulate them that way? Or is your preferred solution simply to say, let's change the legal framework, the kind of playing field, so that competition is easier, so that if Facebook wants to censor all conservatives, there's going to be a social media company that emerges that says, we're here for conservatives? And if that's your goal, what are some of those legislative solutions that can make competition more plausible?
Well, to your first question, Glenn, the idea that somebody in government is going to decide what a private corporation can put on their platform and what they can't put on their platform is offensive to me. I believe in freedom, and I believe that an individual can decide what he wants to, the sign he wants to put on his house. And I think a company can decide what they want to put on their platform. And there should be some restrictions in terms of violence and other areas that affect the general welfare. But no matter how offensive speech is, if it doesn't lead to violence, other really sensitive areas, I think that's what America is. The answer to incorrect speech is more correct speech. It isn't shutting down incorrect speech. And so the answer to Amazon not allowing a book to be sold is more Barnes and Nobles out there, and more. I choose, frankly, who I do business with based on how they conduct themselves. And I think more Americans.
But what can you do to make that happen? What can you do to facilitate the ability of competitors to Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple to thrive and to grow?
So one of the things that we've done is this portability that I mentioned earlier, where you own your data and you can take it where you want. Another idea is these companies have grown because of all these mergers that have happened. So these 4 companies have to show that any merger that they engage in for a period of 10 years is pro-competitive, instead of the government having to prove it's anti-competitive. And by doing that, we're giving the opportunity for those companies that are being merged or acquired to seek other companies to merge with and to create competition. We're also, one of the bills is to allow attorney generals to sue in their home state. Too often those lawsuits get moved to the Northern District of California, which is a very beneficial district for these high-tech companies. Another one of the bills addresses the need for staff at the FTC and Department of Justice. They have less staff now than they had 10 years ago. The filing fees for these mergers and acquisitions haven't been changed in 20 years. So they're very practical bills to try to create this competition and enforcement.
What about just a couple more questions about the FTC? There is a new chair of that body, Lena Khan, who is very well respected and known as a specialist, somebody who has been studying and advocating for greater antitrust enforcement, specifically with regard to these companies. She was nominated by President Biden, but received a pretty bipartisan approval in her confirmation in the Senate. She's already instituted some changes, including making FTC meetings open, I think, to the public for the first time in, I don't know how long, 20 years or so. And obviously Amazon is quite concerned about what the FTC under her leadership intends to do, because they're demanding she recuse herself on the grounds that she had previously expressed opinions. I don't know what person would be qualified for that job who hadn't previously talked about those issues, but clearly Amazon, wants to neutralize her. Do you have a view yet about her leadership and what role the FTC under her might be able to play that's constructive?
Well, I've had a conversation with her, and I stressed in our conversation that I hope what she does is bipartisan within the FTC and seen as bipartisan in Congress. And I think if she does that, and it's not targeted towards one side or the other, she will accomplish the goals that this legislation has set out to do.
So the last question is kind of a broad one. I'm really interested in your view on it, because I kind of see you as one of the exemplars of what I see anyway as a kind of ideological re-scrambling. You might want to call it a kind of issue by issue realignment that has been taking place for a while. I think was accelerated by the Trump years. I was just thinking about the fact that we've been talking for, 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so. I don't think there's a single thing you said in that time, despite our fairly, wide-ranging conversation about these issues, that somebody on the left or a liberal would find particularly objectionable. In fact, I think it would resonate in a lot of ways for a lot of people who are really worried on the other side of the ideological spectrum about Silicon Valley concentrated power in the way that you are. You've also cast some foreign policy votes that I think is true in the same way. You were one of the Republicans who voted to repeal the AUMF for Iraq, and have been I think an outspoken advocate of the need to end the war in Afghanistan. Do you see that there's a kind of, maybe realignment is too strong of a term, but at least like an erosion of these traditional left-right divisions that kind of create new opportunities, not just in antitrust, but foreign policy, economic policy, and in other realms for people who once were told that they were on the right and the left and therefore had to hate each other, to actually come together and find common ground in a way that may not have been possible, say, 5 or 10 years ago?
Yes, and I tell you, my home state of Colorado is a perfect example. 20 years ago, the Republican Party had the most registered voters, the Democrat Party next, and the unaffiliateds were a distant third. Now in Colorado, the unaffiliateds are the highest number of registered voters, 10 points, 12 points lower Democrats, and another 5 points lower Republicans. And the realignment that we're talking about is a general dissatisfaction in the population with how the parties have aligned themselves and why they keep fighting and aren't solving problems that they should be solving. And so I absolutely think that there are people on the left that will hear me talk about monopolies and agree. And I think there are people on the right that hear me talk about freedom and spending and our use of military force that agree. And so I do believe Trump was a disruptor. I think that we are in this country going through a realignment. And if we're going as Republicans to be successful, we need to get ahead of that realignment.
Last question.
This is the second last question.
Exactly. I always do that. I'm sorry, I cheated a little bit, but this is really the last question. That's when you know it's really the last question. I know there are a lot of Republicans or conservatives or people on the right who generally vote Republican who are frustrated with the fact that what they're hearing from their political leaders about these issues seems very different than what they're actually doing. And for those people who are watching or who are reading what I'm going to write to accompany this interview, what can you tell them about what they can actually do to make it more difficult for these Republican office holders to say one thing and do another? Does calling really help? Like the office, does making it clear to them that they're being watched and this disparity is seen? Does that help? I mean, what can people do who are frustrated help in order to generate more support for this bill?
I think everybody has a skill set, and I would encourage people. I've been an outspoken opponent of the 1619 Project and critical race theory, and I think that people need to run for school board, and I think people need to run for city council, and I think people need to understand that they can't just sit back and watch TV and start yelling and screaming and throwing things at the TV. They have to get involved, and we're a country that encourages that kind of involvement. The best thing to do, yes, you can write an email, and yes, you can make a telephone call, but volunteering on somebody's campaign and actually having that person's ear for a little bit of time when you're walking door to door with them or you're at a rally is so important. And I got to tell you, I go to DC and I just get beat up half the time. I come back to my district and I get standing ovations and people shaking my hands, and I just have to keep coming back to my district to get energized. And it's those people that are encouraging me to go back and fight in the swamp that make me want to do that. And I think it's so important for people to get involved in any way to make this kind of difference.
Well, it was great that you used the opportunity of the truly last question to raise the issue of critical race theory in the 1619 Project. So at least there's a couple of things you said that people on the left won't agree with, and kind of will get their energy higher. But I want to thank you for the work you're doing on what I consider to be one of the most important issues. I think this concentrated power in the hands of Silicon Valley is a genuine menace to our ability to have a healthy democracy. And I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to me about it as well.
Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate it very much.